Well, someone needs to draw a line in the sand and say no more.
Well, I think a great line was drawn. I'll share a quote with you. The fact that we're here today to debate raising America's debt limit is a sign of a leadership failure. It's a sign that the U.S. government can't pay its own bills. It's a sign that we now depend on ongoing financial assistance from foreign countries to finance our government's reckless fiscal policies. Increasing America's debt weakens us domestically and internationally. Leadership means that the buck stops here, and instead, Washington is shifting the burden of bad choices today onto the backs of our children and grandchildren. America has a debt problem and a failure of leadership. Americans deserve better. Now, that's not my quote. That was freshman Senator Barack Obama's floor speech back in 2006.
Wow, and
a lot changes over the years, particularly when you start having responsibility for decisions. I don't know if you caught Jay Carney the other day, who, the last name Carney, I think he's perhaps the most aptly named press secretary in history. And he told us that President Obama thinks that comment was a mistake now. And now he realizes that raising the debt ceiling is so important to the health of the economy and the global economy that it's not a vote that even when you're protesting an administration's policy, you can play around with. But I guess back in 2006, it was okay to play around with it.
Jeez.
And, anybody that needs a refresher that's listening in, the debt back then that he was so adamant against and was lobbying to prevent Congress from increasing the debt ceiling, we were talking about $9 trillion. Now, under his administration, it's gone up 60% since then.
Yeah. Isn't the current debt ceiling somewhere around $14 trillion? Well,
14.3, yeah.
Right. So, $9 trillion was too much, but $14 trillion isn't enough.
$9 trillion, was a reflection upon failed leadership. And he repeatedly makes that comment. It's just a sign of failed leadership. And the American people deserve better. Well, you know what? I think he was right. And the American people deserve better today. What they deserve are some specific solutions. When you have the rhetoric going out, the various different things that have been talked about, we jokingly said, let's eliminate all the czars. Well, I already did that in my books. I explained how we get rid of them and how to rationalize that. President talked earlier in the year, we have 14,000 federal buildings. Well, let's look at, rather than just selling those off, because the reality is in today's economy, who's going to finance the acquisition of an empty building with no tenant? Well, the banks aren't going to do it. China's already indicating it's not going to allow us to have any more debt. The only person I can think that might have an interest is Donald Trump, so he could, flip them, make enough money to fund his presidential run. But, seriously, there's not going to be a market for those 14,000 buildings. But do we hear anybody taking a business approach and saying, well, okay, if we've got these businesses and we want to support small business growth, what if we provided, in effect, incubators for small businesses by providing them with, space that they would otherwise have to pay for? We're not using it anyway. Let them get some value out of that.
Well, that makes sense.
Well, I'm a Common Sense Czar.
I know, but I'm starting to think that common sense is kind of an extinct creature in D.C.
I think it's been gone for a couple of decades.
I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree more. Starting with, I didn't even know how far back you'd have to go since you had any kind of common sense in D.C. Maybe Reagan.
Well, I think what you're going to find is, I think you're starting to see some of the blame on the Bush administration. It's starting to wane. People have grown tired of it, and I guess the poll numbers are reflecting that, hey, you've kind of gotten as much mileage out of that as you can. I think, if I'm trying to follow traditional politics, I'd push it all the way back to Washington. If we didn't have a Constitution and a Declaration of Independence, throw some of the blame on Jefferson as well, well, gosh, we wouldn't find ourselves in the position we're in today. I mean, that's how absurd that argument is. The reality is when you take over a position of leadership, you take over that position with whatever the reality is at that point in time. And from that day forward, it's your responsibility. And you start making some common sense decisions.
Again, that seems like it would be a good thing to do. It seems like it would make sense to do that kind of thing. But then again, I'm not sure where common sense has gone, both in D.C. and around the country for that matter. It's starting to make a comeback, I think. But I don't know. People still vote for people who promise them more than we know they can deliver. We know up front that these guys aren't going to be able to do all these things. But we still vote for them.
Well, I always say some of the greatest lies in American history start with the phrase, "When I'm elected, I will." Fill in the blank after that. Because the reality is particularly, let's just take the presidency as an example. If the president believes he can really do the things that he suggests when campaigning, and he makes a bold statement, "I will do this," apparently that person, whoever it is, and it goes back generations, the president is doing this, they must not have read the Constitution, because they must not understand the separation of powers.
Right, and
so a good starting point would be, I'd love to see these guys in all reality. I like to say they're civil servants who didn't need to pass a test. The post office requires that you pass the civil service test. These guys get in scot-free. So why not have them pass a test that at least shows that they read and understand the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the associated amendments?
That sounds like a great idea.
It's common sense.
But where I get... the thing I find really, really entertaining is when people refer to the President of the United States as the most powerful man in the free world. But if you look at the President's powers, what the President can really do, he can't do that much.
Not if you've read the Constitution. And certainly none of the budgetary issues actually reside with the President. Blaming the Bush administration, for example, is not consistent with the Constitution.
Or reality, for that matter.
It's kind of a fun exercise that I think demonstrates the lack of common sense. You have politicians, both sides of the aisles, trying to refer to who's rich and who's not. And, for simplicity purposes, they picked a number, $250,000 for a couple, $125,000 if you're single. But take $250,000. Kind of sounds right, feels right. That sounds like a lot of money to most people. But have you ever noticed they didn't bother to index it? Now you're out in Arkansas, correct?
Yes.
So I did a article back on December 14th called "Taxing Our Patience." And one of the things I looked at, I thought, just for fun, let's take a look at what $250,000 gets you in Manhattan as adjusted gross income versus Fort Smith, Arkansas.
Uh-huh.
Now, if you used Fort Smith, Arkansas as your baseline, person making $250,000 in Fort Smith, Arkansas, for someone in Manhattan, they'd have to earn almost $640,000 a year to have the same buying power.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, if you reverse that, a couple living in Fort Smith earning a little under $98,000 a year has the exact same buying power of one of the rich people in Manhattan earning $250,000, on a pre-tax basis. But remember, the Manhattan household is considered rich and can be taxed well in excess of the rate that would apply to those middle-class households in Fort Smith. And what's really cool is if you live in Fort Smith, you avoid the stigma of being called rich. None of that makes any common sense.
It's true. And you can take it to the next step, and where people talk about the super rich, and you talk about people making $1 million being super rich. And again, I mean, it depends on where you live as to whether or not that has a lot more buying power. If you want to see a wider margin, Fort Smith is south of Fort Smith is actually where I grew up. But look up Pine Bluff, Arkansas. It's even further down.
Yep.
And so, I mean, it's really, really interesting that, yeah.
Well, I wrote an article back in 2009, October 16th of 2009, that's on my blog on the web. And I refer to it as the ignorance tax. So this was back in the time when the administration was first talking about the fact that 95% of the people in America are going to get a tax cut. We're only going to tax these rich people making $250,000. And one of the things we're going to do is increase the money supply, which is exactly what's being discussed again. Now, there's a funny thing that happens when you increase the money supply. There's this little thing called inflation. And if you go back and look historically at the type of inflation that we could expect to experience with the types of increases in the money supply versus the increase in productivity, you're looking at about a 14% inflation rate, which takes you back to Jimmy Carter's days.
Yeah.
So let's say that's only half right. So now let's say I bought a loaf of bread for $1. Well, it's going to cost $1.07 if that was only half right. And my gas is going to go up. My clothing's going to go up. Everything's going to go up 7%. And it doesn't matter whether I'm poor, I'm middle class, or I'm rich, or I'm one of the uber rich. The costs are going to go up the same. So in effect, because of what government is doing, common sense tells me it's the same as applying a tax. It's just doing it in a more insidious way.
All right. Well, we're coming towards the end of the show. Do you have anything you'd like to... do you have any appearances coming up? Any radio or TV appearances?
Well, I'm going to do a book signing at a tax day in Oceanside, California, coming up actually this Friday. I'm going to be doing book signings and a couple of speeches in the Dayton, Ohio area at the Armed Forces Family Aid Concert on April 30th. I'll be doing Rick Amato's show in San Diego, California, which can be picked up on the internet, as you know. Mm-hmm. I'll be doing that show on the 28th, and maybe one or two times before that. I may go in as a guest before that, but I'll be hosting it that night. Okay. So they're going to keep me busy trying to bring common sense to America.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for joining us today. I'd like to take this moment, as I do most every week, to take a moment of silence for the passing of global warming. Global warming, you left us too soon and left Al Gore with nothing to do. It's sad, but true. Next week, we have another great guest coming in. We've got a congressman from Michigan, Thad McCotter, will be with us next week for the show. So be sure and tune in. He has some interesting things to say. In fact, during the budget speech, he made a reference to Led Zeppelin, which played out really well. I thought that was a good thing. So he'll be on the show next week. The week after, we've got Jedediah Bila from Fox News will be on the show. And again, I want to thank everyone for tuning in this week. And tune in weeks to come for more guests here on the Masked Elephant Show. With me, Dylan Farrell, Dave Johnson, my crew. I want to thank everyone for watching, and tune in next week.